Our correspondent Jan Onoszko has more on this from Rio. Jan, tell us more about this purchase and who will benefit from it.
Well, this land is located in Paraná in the south of Brazil, and it's destined for the Ava-Guarani people. Now, they were forcibly removed from their land in the 1970s, as you say, when Brazil's military dictatorship built the Itaipu hydroelectric dam, and as a result, their ancestral lands were flooded. Now, it's expected that 27 families consisting of around 90 people will move onto this new property, this newly purchased property, within the next 2 months. And it's the latest in a series of land purchases made by the Brazilian government after they signed an agreement back in March 2025 in which they agreed to set aside around 41 million euros to buy at least 3,000 hectares for the Ava-Guarani people as part of their historical reparations. Now, so far, since that agreement was signed just over a year ago, the government has actually spent around 14.5 million euros buying up just over 700 hectares for the Ava-Guarani people. And as part of that agreement, the Itaipu hydroelectric plant will also restore the environment there, and it will also provide essential services such as electricity, running water, sanitation, as well as health centres and also schools.
All right, so why is Itaipu and the government buying land for indigenous people half a century after the dam was built?
Well, that's also a question that indigenous people are asking, except they frame it slightly differently. They are asking, why is it taking Brazil so long to honour its 1988 constitution and commit to historical reparations for indigenous people, as well as committing to protecting their lands? And to make that point, around 7,000 indigenous activists descended on Brasilia earlier this month. They marched on 3 Powers Square in the centre of the capital to protest against what they claim are land violations by illegal farming, logging and mining projects. They say also that the rate or the speed of reparations is far too slow. Now, the reason why reparations have dragged on so long in Brazil is that there is a lot of resistance to indigenous land claims in Brazil by the powerful agricultural lobby within Brazil's Congress and Senate. And indeed, that lobby even tried to change the constitution to mean that reparations would only be recognized for indigenous lands occupied in 1988, and therefore not recognizing any lands lost by indigenous people before that year. But Brazil's Supreme Court threw out that attempt to change the constitution, and indeed it has now entrenched those clauses about indigenous rights within the constitution in order to try and make it more difficult for lawmakers to change the constitution in the future.
All right, so tell us more about the government's record on indigenous rights.
Well, those thousands of protesters, those indigenous activists are also very unhappy with Lula. They say that while on the one hand he claims to defend indigenous rights, on the other hand he does nothing to stop projects going ahead which will threaten their lands. Projects like plans for a new gold mine in Pará in the north of Brazil, which will be constructed by the Canadian giant Sun. At the same time, though, indigenous activists do recognize that Lula has signed off on demarcating 20 new indigenous lands, or 20 further indigenous lands, since he returned to the presidency in 2023. But they do say that those demarcations are not happening fast enough, especially given that Brazil's Supreme Court has now put a deadline on those demarcations. They say that all demarcations have to be concluded within the next 10 years, and that is something that indigenous activists say could create further land disputes in the future.
All right, Jan Onoszko, thank you very much for bringing us that story from Rio.